So today we're going to connect the dots between a classic psychological theory from the 1950s and a term you've probably seen all over your social media feed. How in the world did we go from this huge idea about how babies bond to the modern-day challenge of the default parent?
Okay, let's just dive right in. Take a second and really think about it. In your family, or maybe the one you grew up in, who's the person that everyone just automatically goes to for, well, everything? The permission slips, the doctor's appointments, the mystery of the lost sock? Yeah, that person is what we now call the default parent.
But to really get how this role so often gets created, we've got to go back in time. We need to look at the foundational idea that really shaped so much of how we think about parenting, attachment theory, first pioneered by the psychiatrist John Bowlby.
So what's the core idea here? It's pretty simple, actually. Babies are born with this biological need to form a really strong bond with a main caregiver. And Bowlby argued this isn't just about feeling loved or getting cuddles, it's literally a survival mechanism that's hardwired into us for safety and protection, especially when we're between 6 months and 2 years old.
And as this theory grew and changed, it really boiled down to these three key principles. First, we are just wired for that close, one-to-one connection. Second, that bond is how we first learn to handle our emotions, especially something as big as fear. And third, having that secure attachment gives us a safe base to explore the world from, to adapt and to grow. You can think of it like our launch pad into life.
Now, here's a really key piece of Bowlby's original theory. It's this concept called monotropy. He basically proposed that even if a baby has a few caregivers, they form one attachment that is way more important than all the others. And historically, this special primary person was just assumed to be the mother. Now, hang on to that idea of a single primary caregiver. It's going to become really important in a minute.
All right, a theory is one thing, but how do you actually test it in the real world? Well, that's where the developmental psychologist Mary Ainsworth comes into the picture. She designed a now famous experiment to try and observe and measure these attachment bonds in a lab setting.
It was called the strange situation procedure. And as you can see, it's a whole series of carefully planned steps. You've got separations, you've got reunions, you've got a caregiver and a stranger coming and going. The whole point was to create just a little bit of stress to see what the baby would do, to activate those attachment behaviors. What happens when mom leaves? How do they act when she comes back in the room?
And this is where things get really interesting, because it shows this huge gap between the theory and what actually happened. Researchers expected to see all this distress, separation anxiety and stranger fear everywhere. But the results? Not so much. Get this, only about 1 in 5 babies cried when their mom left them with a stranger. And even fewer, only 1 in 10 actually followed her to the door. The way babies behaved in the real world was just way more complex than the theory had predicted. So let's zoom in on that idea of separation anxiety for a second, because it is the perfect example of just how nuanced all of this really is.
What's wild is that research shows that even at the absolute peak age for separation anxiety, we're talking 13 to 15 months old, a full 21%, that's more than 1 in 5 babies, show little or no distress at all when their caregiver leaves. So that popular image we all have of every single baby wailing the second a parent walks away, it's just not true.
And you might be asking, why is that? Well, it's because context is everything. A baby's reaction totally depends on so many other things. Is a grandparent they love right there? Did the baby crawl away on their own to go explore something? Are there cool toys to play with? Can they still hear their parents' voice from the next room? So the big takeaway here is separation anxiety isn't some automatic switch that just flips on. It's a response that really depends on the whole social environment.
Okay, so let's connect the dots. How does all this history lead us to today? Well, that powerful original idea of monotropy, of one primary special caregiver, it didn't just stay in old textbooks. Nope, it shaped decades of our cultural expectations about parenting, and that leads us directly to this modern phenomenon we call the default parent syndrome.
So the default parent is the one who, by default, is on the hook for most of the parenting and household stuff. They're the ones carrying what we call the mental load. And that's not just about doing the tasks, it's about remembering all the tasks, planning them, and organizing them. And even in partnerships where both parents are super involved, this imbalance often just sticks around, mostly because of these cultural norms we've had for so long.
And let's be crystal clear,
This is not just some small inconvenience. As the psychologist Dr. Amber Thornton puts it, this syndrome is actively eating away at the well-being and mental health of millions of mothers every single day. The stakes here are incredibly high.
And you can see here, the fallout from this, it really ripples through the entire family. It's not just one person. For the default parent, it often leads to burnout, resentment, a real decline in mental health. For the partner, it can create this emotional distance, and they don't get to build up their own parenting skills as much. And for the kids, it can actually damage their relationship with both parents and set some really unrealistic expectations. It's a dynamic where nobody really wins.
So if this whole dynamic is so harmful, what can we actually do about it? Well, the good news is there is a clear path forward for families who want to start rebalancing that load. All right, so here are 5 steps based on expert advice to start taking this syndrome apart. Think of it like a roadmap. First, you just have to acknowledge that it's real and it's happening. Then, you got to get specific. How does it actually show up in your house? Third, you create a shared vision. What do you both want your family life to feel like? Fourth, and this is important, set small, concrete goals. Don't try to fix it all at once. And finally, and this is key, you have to schedule time to check in, see how it's going, and make adjustments. It's a process, not a one-time fix.
You know, dismantling this inside your own home is a huge and crucial first step. But this dynamic doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? So we want to leave you with a bigger question to think about. How can our communities, and maybe especially our workplaces, evolve to better support the vital, important work of all caregivers, not just a default one?